December 1941 arrived with a hard clarity. On airfields across the American West Coast, young airmen watched their newest fighter, the Bell P-39 Airacobra, sitting motionless on the tarmac. Sirens called other squadrons into the sky, yet the Airacobra remained grounded, its canopy catching the winter light like an unopened promise. In those first days after Pearl Harbor, when fear and urgency shaped every decision, its stillness delivered a message more cutting than any official report. The nation's new fighter was not ready for the war it had just entered. Reputation travels faster than aircraft. Within weeks, the P-39 was spoken of in low tones, its faults repeated with the certainty of lived experience. Pilots climbing into other machines, Warhawks, Lightnings, even aging interceptors, looked across the field and saw an aircraft considered too sluggish above 15,000 feet, too unconventional in structure, and too experimental in ways no one had asked for. To them, altitude was life. And this machine, they said, had none. Inside engineering offices in Buffalo, doubt spread with equal quiet. Bell Aircraft had gambled on a radical idea, placing the engine behind the pilot, connected to a long drive shaft running under the cockpit floor. On paper, it promised balance and firepower. In practice, it produced uneasy vibrations, maintenance challenges, and a center of gravity that punished mistakes. Privately, engineers wondered whether innovation had crossed the line into imprudence, a design built around ambition rather than battlefield necessity. Rumor became currency among pilots. Some claimed the Airacobra couldn't breathe in thin air. Others insisted it stalled too sharply or climbed too slowly to meet enemy fighters. The Army Air Forces did not counter the gossip. Instead, attention drifted toward machines that inspired confidence, the rugged P-40 and the emerging twin-engine P-38. Official memos grew gentler, but combat evaluations were not. One described the P-39 simply as unfit for modern war, a phrase that settled like frost on the aircraft's future. And yet one question lingered behind every critique and complaint. Why would America field a fighter that performed worst in the very arena where air battles were won? The answer, though still hidden, was already taking shape. Far from these airfields, in a theater where altitude mattered far less, and survival demanded a different kind of machine. To understand how the Airacobra became the outsider of American aviation, we must return to 1937, to a small but restless company on the banks of the Niagara River. Bell Aircraft, scarcely a year old, proposed a fighter that challenged every convention of U.S. design. At a time when most engineers still trusted familiar silhouettes, nose-mounted engines, rifles in the wings, Bell imagined a machine that looked as if it had stepped out of a different decade. It was a gamble born not from arrogance, but from the belief that air combat itself was about to change. Central to the design was a single audacious idea: move the engine from the nose to a position directly behind the pilot. By concentrating mass at the center, the aircraft could, in theory, pivot with extraordinary quickness. In the mind of a designer, the mid-engine layout hinted at maneuvers no American fighter had ever attempted. Tight turns, rapid rolls, a sense of balance that bordered on the improbable. On paper, it promised agility that matched European prototypes and surpassed most of them. But agility alone could not define the machine. Bell planned to mount a 37mm cannon through the hollow propeller shaft, a weapon more suited to ship decks than fighter wings. Its purpose was singular: to break open enemy bombers with one or two well-placed shots. Americans had never fielded a weapon of this size in a frontline fighter. The idea felt revolutionary, and for a moment, even inevitable. Early wind tunnel tests fueled this optimism. Streamlined contours and compact weight suggested speeds beyond 400 miles per hour, a figure that placed the prototype among the fastest fighters in the world. Engineers spoke of the future as if it were already secured. Yet beneath their confidence lay a concession few outside the company noticed. To meet cost limits and accelerate production, the turbo supercharger, critical for high-altitude performance, was quietly removed. It was a decision shaped not by vision, but by budgets and deadlines. Designers understood what the omission meant. The aircraft would breathe poorly above 15,000 feet, surrendering the very domain where modern air battles were expected to unfold. So when the first prototype left the runway, sunlight catching the new paint along its spine, its promise was already compromised. Its revolutionary ideas were still intact, but the flaw that would define its reputation was already written into the metal. And in the years ahead, that flaw would meet a battlefield unlike anything its creators had imagined. The war introduced the P-39 to combat with a sober lesson. In the humid air of the Southwest Pacific, American pilots discovered that their new fighters began to wheeze above 12,000 feet. The thin atmosphere exposed the missing turbo supercharger with painful clarity. Climbs became labored, engine power faded, and the ceiling that looked acceptable in training became a trap in real combat. What had been an engineering compromise now revealed itself as a battlefield liability. Dogfights against the Mitsubishi A6M0 made this truth impossible to deny. The Japanese fighters rose effortlessly, turning with a lightness that felt almost unreal to the men in the heavier Airacobras. Every encounter reinforced the same pattern. The Zero dictated the altitude, the pace, and the angle of attack. Pilots spoke of diving away rather than fighting back, of watching an opponent spiral upward while their own aircraft gasped for lift. In such skies, the P-39 seemed a step behind a war that moved relentlessly forward. Combat reports from New Guinea and the Solomons carried a warning stripped of comfort. The Airacobra, they said, was not to be employed where enemy fighters can dictate altitude. It was a technical judgment, yet it read like an epitaph. Ground crews, working under corrugated shelters streaked with tropical rain, patched bullet holes and replaced stressed components with growing frustration. Machines returned, damaged not from recklessness, but from a design that left them vulnerable where the fighting was fiercest. Around the flight lines, morale thinned. Commanders, measured in tone but firm in action, began shifting P-39 units out of contested airspace. Any replacement was welcome. P-40s with their rugged frames, P-38s with their climbing power, even older aircraft that simply survived better above the clouds. Newspapers at home framed the story with quiet disappointment, calling the Airacobra America's troubled experiment. For a nation expecting swift victories in the air, the title felt uncomfortably accurate. By 1943, it appeared that the P-39's destiny was sealed. A few would remain stateside as trainers. Others would be melted down, their lessons preserved only in reports and memory. Yet the Airacobra was not finished. Far from these Pacific airstrips, another nation waited, one preparing for a different kind of war, at altitudes where the Airacobra's flaws meant little, and its strengths meant everything. In the winter of 1941, as German armored columns pushed toward Moscow and whole Soviet armies fell back across frozen roads, the Kremlin sent an urgent request to its distant ally. Through the Lend-Lease program, the USSR needed fighters, any fighters, capable of surviving the brutal war unfolding at low altitude. American officials offered what they had in surplus: the P-39 Airacobra, an aircraft already burdened by doubt. To U.S. pilots, it was a failed experiment. To Soviet planners, it was a question that demanded a different kind of answer. When the first Airacobras arrived at Soviet airfields, engineers gathered around them not with dismissal, but with curiosity. The defects were obvious. The aircraft tired quickly above 15,000 feet. Its missing turbo supercharger robbed it of breath where Western pilots spent most of their time. Yet instead of asking what the machine could not do, Soviet engineers asked a quieter, sharper question. What is it good at? In a war that punished idealism, this was not optimism, it was survival. The evaluation began on the ground. They studied the Airacobra's armored cockpit, its strong landing gear, and the dense concentration of weight around the fuselage centerline. These were not accidents of design. They were advantages waiting for the right pilot. The Soviets noted its powerful 37mm cannon and synchronized machine guns, weapons that delivered instantaneous punch at close range. Where Americans saw excess, Soviet tacticians saw purpose. Then came the realization that shifted the aircraft's entire fate. Soviet air combat rarely occurred above the clouds. The Eastern Front was a war of ground attack, low sweeps, and fast engagement seldom rising beyond 10,000 feet. Pilots fought almost within sight of the soil below them, diving on convoys, intercepting Stukas, and protecting infantry locked in desperate battles. Here, at these altitudes, the Airacobra was not weak. It was strong. Test pilots returned from their first flights wearing expressions seldom seen during that bitter year. They reported that the P-39 rolled cleanly, turned with predictability, and remained stable under the violent maneuvers demanded by low-altitude fighting. Its mid-engine balance, mocked elsewhere, made the aircraft feel, at least to Soviet hands, anchored and obedient. Most striking was the cannon. Fired in short bursts, it tore through targets with a finality the pilots had only dreamed of in earlier machines. The Red Air Force understood instantly what this meant. At low level, where survival hinged on stability and firepower, the Airacobra was not a flawed fighter. It was an ideal one. With a decisiveness born of necessity, the Soviet Union placed the largest order for P-39s in the world. In doing so, they rescued the aircraft from obsolescence and pulled it into the center of a war defined by endurance. And as the first shipments moved east across the Arctic routes, few in America realized what the Soviets had discovered, that this rejected machine was about to become a frontline weapon in the most ferocious air battles of the Eastern Front. When the P-39 entered Soviet service, its identity was not merely adjusted, it was rewritten. Trainers from the Red Air Force approached the aircraft without the burden of earlier expectations. They did not ask it to chase bombers at altitude or duel opponents in thinning air. Instead, they studied the realities of the Eastern Front: fast battles under low clouds, ambushes near the treetops, and sudden dives onto armored columns. In this world, the Airacobra was not a compromise. It was an opportunity waiting to be shaped into a weapon of the front line. The first step was understanding how it moved. Soviet instructors conducted careful turning trials, tightening radii, measuring roll speed, and mapping the limits of the airframe. What emerged surprised even the veterans among them. The mid-engine layout, the feature Western pilots had distrusted, gave the aircraft a balance uncommon in fighters of its size. Under pressure, the P-39 rolled sharply, almost instinctively, as though its mass pivoted around a single invisible point. The Soviets realized they were not flying a failed high-altitude interceptor. They were flying a brawler designed, almost by accident, for the knife fight at low level. Then came the matter of firepower. The 37mm cannon, dismissed elsewhere as slow-firing and impractical, became the centerpiece of a new doctrine: one burst, one kill. Soviet tacticians instructed pilots to close to near point-blank range before firing, using the Airacobra's stability to line up decisive shots. Against Stukas, Henschels, and even Messerschmitts caught unaware, the results were immediate and devastating. A single round could shear a wing, break a fuselage, or rip through an engine block with a finality that left no ambiguity. To support these tactics, pilots began altering cockpit ergonomics, small adjustments that made their work faster and cleaner. Gun sights were recalibrated for extremely short engagement distances. Seats were modified for better visibility during tight turns. Even throttle mounts were changed to reduce the seconds lost in high-stress maneuvers. These were not dramatic redesigns. They were refinements born from experience, crafted by men who fought at altitudes where precision mattered more than theory. On the ground, maintenance crews addressed the problems the Americans had struggled with. They improved coolant circulation, added winterization measures, and learned to service the Allison engine in field conditions harsher than any factory had imagined. Overheating, once a chronic complaint, faded into near insignificance. The aircraft became resilient, trusted not because it was perfect, but because it could be understood. Within months, Soviet headquarters began sending reports westward. They spoke of pilots praising the aircraft's handling, of victories attributed directly to its cannon, of squadrons requesting additional Airacobras by name. In Washington, these claims were met with polite skepticism. But on the Eastern Front, the truth was already visible in the skies. A machine dismissed in the West was gaining conviction in the East, preparing to prove that its reputation had never belonged to the aircraft itself, but to the hands that had yet to use it properly. As the P-39 settled into Soviet service, a new cast of names began to rise, pilots whose reputations would one day define the Allied air war. Among them were Alexander Pokrishkin, Grigory Rechkalov, and Nikolai Gulayev, men who approached the Airacobra not with resignation, but with curiosity. They studied its behavior, understood its rhythms, and committed themselves to discovering what the machine could become when flown without the weight of Western assumptions. In their hands, the aircraft received something it had never truly been given before: belief. These pilots trained at altitudes so low that the treetops blurred beneath their wings. They learned to use the P-39's strong acceleration at ground level, pushing the throttle forward until the aircraft leapt ahead in sudden, controlled bursts. This tactic, dangerous, demanding, and perfectly suited to the Eastern Front, became a cornerstone of their doctrine. Where others sought height, they sought advantage in the shadows of the forests, using speed and timing as the true arbiters of survival. Within this environment, Soviet air strategy shifted. Altitude, once considered a prerequisite for dominance, became a luxury few could afford. Battles unfolded under cloud cover, so close to the terrain that pilots described the land as a constant presence, a silent witness to their decisions. The Airacobra, stable at low level and quick to respond, fit this reality with unexpected precision. In the cockpit, these aviators discovered a fighter that rewarded discipline and punished carelessness. A machine that made no promises yet delivered faithfully when handled with respect. Practical details also shaped their success. The P-39's tricycle landing gear, an innovation overlooked by many, offered safer takeoffs from the muddy, uneven airstrips carved into the Eastern Front. In spring thaws, when runways became fields of churned soil, this stability saved lives. Pilots who had once feared ground accidents now trusted the Airacobra to lift cleanly even in chaotic conditions, reducing the margin of misfortune that haunted so many wartime departures. Communication improved as well. The American-built radios, more reliable than those fitted in many Soviet fighters, allowed clearer coordination between units. In a theater where confusion could erase entire squadrons, the ability to convey a warning or a vector with confidence was a quiet but decisive advantage. Airacobra regiments soon earned a reputation for moving like a single organism, alert, cohesive, and disciplined. These units became elite not through mystique, but through rigor. They developed their own signals, their own formations, their own expectations for precision. What had once been a rejected fighter now formed the backbone of groups whose names carried weight across the front. And in the skies of the Kuban and Kursk, these pilots prepared to push the P-39 beyond anything its designers, or its critics, had imagined. The winter of 1942 brought a new geography of war. Around Stalingrad, smoke hung so low that even midday light seemed filtered through ash. The air was thick with dust from collapsed buildings, and the horizon wavered under the impact of artillery. In this harsh, enclosed world, the P-39 Airacobra found the conditions for which it had never been designed, yet somehow had always suited. At altitudes where clouds brushed the rooftops and engine noise echoed between ruins, the aircraft's supposed weaknesses fell away. What remained was a machine perfectly adapted to a battlefield with no vertical space to spare. Soviet pilots quickly recognized the opportunity. Instructors taught them to fly at 100 to 300 meters, so low that the aircraft's shadow sometimes moved ahead of it like a warning. From this altitude, surprise became a weapon. German columns advancing toward the Volga felt safety beneath the cloud cover, unaware that a new threat now hunted just below it. Airacobra pilots used the broken skyline of Stalingrad as camouflage, darting from smoke to shadow until the moment they released their attack. The aircraft's acceleration at low level, once a footnote in American manuals, became the driving force of these ambushes. The doctrine was simple, but it demanded iron nerves. Pilots avoided climbing duels, knowing the Allison engine would betray them above the haze. Instead, they struck in fast, slashing passes, firing only at close range, then retreating behind terrain or industrial ruins before German escorts could respond. These attacks were not graceful, but they were effective, designed for a front where air combat resembled ground fighting carried into the sky. The Airacobra's strengths, stability, instant roll response, and raw firepower aligned exactly with the demands of this brutal style of war. Nothing defined this transformation more than the 37 mm cannon. At Western altitudes, it had been criticized for its recoil and slow rate of fire. Here, it became a decisive instrument. A single shell could rip through the unarmored belly of a Ju-87, detonate inside the fuselage of a He-111, or smash through the boiler of an armored train. German reports began to mention aircraft broken apart in midair, victims of a weapon that seemed out of scale for a fighter. For Soviet pilots, the cannon offered something rare during the darkest days of the war: certainty. If they hit their target, it would fall. To extract every advantage, pilots pushed the P-39 harder than any American training syllabus had foreseen. They pulled the aircraft into turns at speeds considered unsafe, inverted it during evasive dives, and fired their cannon at angles that strained the nose structure. When American instructors later observed these maneuvers, many claimed they would have grounded the pilots instantly. But on the Eastern Front, survival was the only measure. The aircraft tolerated the punishment, and the pilots trusted it more with each mission flown. Behind the lines, Soviet workshops worked with equal intensity. Ammunition belts were reorganized to place the heaviest rounds at ideal positions for the first firing burst. Gun harmonization tightened to distances far shorter than American doctrine permitted. Engineers experimented with lubricant mixes to keep weapons functioning in temperatures that froze lesser machinery. Each modification sharpened the Aracobra's lethality until it became less an imported fighter and more a native instrument of Soviet tactics. By early 1943, whispers began to move through the frontline units. Ground troops spoke of a fighter that arrived without warning, struck with devastating force, and disappeared behind smoke before counterfire could reach it. Luftwaffe crews learned to respect its silhouette, recognizing the distinctive nose profile that meant a cannon shell might follow. Squadron diaries described missions where a single P-39 accounted for multiple enemy aircraft in the space of minutes. What had once been dismissed as a failed design was earning a reputation carved entirely from battlefield proof. In the shattered districts around Stalingrad, where every advantage was measured in lives saved and meters gained, the Airacobra was no longer an experiment. It was becoming one of the deadliest weapons in the sector, just as the great counteroffensives of 1943 were preparing to begin. By early 1943, as the front shifted toward the Kuban and the skies filled with the smoke of two clashing air forces, one pilot began to see patterns invisible to others. Alexander Pokryshkin, already respected for his sharp judgment and calm precision, realized that the P-39 was not merely a tool to be flown. It was a platform upon which an entirely new form of Soviet air combat could be built. In a war shaped by improvisation, he chose to craft doctrine instead, and he used the Airacobra as his proving ground. Pokryshkin studied every engagement he survived, mapping the movements of German formations, the angles of their dives, and the timing of their turns. From these observations, he developed what he called energy maneuverability thinking, an approach that emphasized speed retention, positional awareness, and controlled aggression. It was a philosophy decades ahead of its time, one that Western analysts would not formally articulate until the jet age. But here, in the propeller-driven chaos of 1943, it found its first true expression in the hands of a Soviet fighter ace flying an American machine. At the heart of his doctrine was discipline. Pokryshkin insisted that his squadrons attack only when they held the advantage, whether in altitude, speed, or timing. If they lost that advantage, even for a moment, they were to disengage without hesitation. This rule defied the traditional Soviet emphasis on unwavering aggression, yet it saved countless pilots and increased the efficiency of every sortie. The P-39's stability at low altitude and its powerful acceleration made such tactics practical. Under Pokryshkin's method, the Airacobra became not a dueling fighter but a precision instrument, striking only when conditions favored a decisive blow. But the doctrine required more than individual restraint. It demanded orchestration. To coordinate his fighters across the layered sky of the Kuban, Pokryshkin developed a formation system that would become legendary: the Kuban ladder. Instead of a single horizontal group, his squadrons positioned themselves in stacked tiers, each altitude level responsible for a different stage of interception. When German fighters dove, the higher rungs caught them. When they climbed away, the lower rungs struck from below. This vertical ambush created a sense of inevitability in every engagement, as though the Soviets controlled not just the aircraft, but the very structure of the air. The system relied on clear, immediate communication. Here the P-39 provided an unexpected edge. Its American-built radios, often dismissed as luxuries on the resource-starved front, allowed Pukrishkin to coordinate moves with a clarity few Soviet aircraft could match. Commands traveled across the ladder instantly. Shifts in altitude, timing of dives, the execution of feints. What emerged was a network of fighters acting with a unity the Luftwaffe had not anticipated. German pilots began reporting encounters where Soviet aircraft moved as if guided by an invisible hand, responding to their maneuvers with uncanny precision. Pukrishkin's personal achievements grew alongside his doctrine. His victories in the P-39 came not from recklessness, but from control, carefully chosen engagements, perfectly timed strikes, and a commitment to the principles he drilled into his squadrons. In the Airacobra, he found an aircraft that rewarded methodical thinking. Its cannon made short work of bombers and fighters alike. Its low-altitude performance suited the layered battlefields of the Kuban. Its radio and visibility created confidence in every maneuver. By war's end, Pukrishkin would become the second highest-scoring Allied ace. With nearly all his victories earned in the cockpit of a fighter, many in the West had dismissed as obsolete. Under his leadership, the Airacobra became more than a lend-lease delivery. It became the foundation of a doctrinal revolution, one that transformed Soviet air combat from reactive survival to coordinated dominance. And as the summer of 1943 approached, Pukrishkin's new rulebook was about to be tested in the largest armored and aerial confrontation the world had ever seen. War is an engineer with no patience. On the Eastern Front, where cold bent metal and dust-clogged engines, every weakness was exposed without mercy. The P-39's flaws were no exception. Yet instead of abandoning the aircraft, Soviet ground crews met each shortcoming with a modification, each limitation with an answer. What emerged from their workshops was no longer the factory-standard Airacobra sent across oceans. It was a machine reshaped by the demands of low-altitude combat, a fighter honed through necessity, tempered by experience, and refined in the shadow of the front. One of the first challenges was the nose gear, a point of vulnerability that had worried American evaluators long before the aircraft reached Europe. The tricycle configuration made landings predictable, but the front strut suffered under the rough fields and improvised runways of the Soviet steppe. Ground crews responded not with complaints but with solutions. Reinforcement plates were fitted around the mounting points. Shock absorbers were repacked and retuned. Mechanics learned the exact tolerances that kept the gear from collapsing in mud or snow, transforming a fragile component into something rugged enough for the worst conditions of the front. The Airacobra's takeoffs grew safer, and its reputation among pilots grew steadier. Pilots, too, contributed to the evolution. Many began stripping the aircraft of any weight that did not directly contribute to survival. Armor plates judged redundant were removed. Non-essential equipment was taken out. Even paint was scraped away to gain critical kilograms. The lighter aircraft rolled more sharply, responding with a quickness foreign to its American service. Its initial climb, the very metric that had once condemned it, improved enough to influence tactics. The Airacobra became a creature of agility rather than altitude, shedding not only weight, but the expectations of its original designers. Propeller adjustments soon followed. Soviet mechanics experimented with blade pitch and balance, searching for settings that offered tighter control during violent low-level maneuvers. The standard factory calibration worked well at medium altitudes, but it struggled when pilots demanded instantaneous throttle response at near-ground level. A series of field modifications produced a configuration that shifted power delivery toward the ranges most relevant to the Eastern Front. With this change, the P-39 behaved less like a high-speed interceptor and more like a precision tool, capable of accelerating into a slashing attack or pulling out of a dive with controlled, reliable force. Attention then shifted to the cockpit itself. Pilots flying at altitudes scarcely above the trees needed information at a glance, not behind layers of clutter. Instrument layouts were reorganized. Vital dials were moved upward into the natural sightline. Warning lights were repositioned, and non-essential gauges relegated to the edges of the panel. These changes, though minor in appearance, altered the tempo of combat. Pilots could track engine heat, ammunition counts, and airspeed without shifting focus away from the terrain hurtling beneath them. In battles measured by split seconds, this clarity became a quiet but decisive advantage. Armament, too, received careful and deliberate refinement. The Arakobra's powerful 37mm cannon remained its signature feature, but Soviet regiments soon realized that ammunition choice altered its character dramatically. For bomber interception, they loaded high-explosive rounds capable of tearing open He-111s and Ju-88s. For fighter engagements, they preferred armor-piercing shells that maintained trajectory at close range. Machine guns were calibrated accordingly, synchronized for the distances at which Soviet doctrine demanded attacks. Each mission type produced a different ammunition load, turning the P-39 into a customizable predator designed for the specific prey of that day. With each adaptation, the fighter's personality shifted. What had once been an unruly import became a machine that reflected the realities of its environment. Its nose was stronger, its frame lighter, its power delivery tuned to the violent demands of low-altitude war. The cockpit served the pilot rather than the factory plan. The weapons acted with purpose, not generality. The aircraft no longer resembled the Airacobra sent from the assembly lines in Buffalo. It was something leaner, harder, and infinitely more dangerous. By mid-1943, regiments flying these modified P-39s were no longer regarded as units saddled with a second-tier aircraft. They were recognized as specialists, squadrons that executed precision attacks with discipline and coordination. The Airacobra, once spoken of as a disappointment, had become a keystone of Soviet air power, its transformation driven not by theory but by the relentless crucible of the front. And as the tide of the war began to shift, the P-39 stood at the center of a new reality. It was no longer a rejected design struggling for relevance. It was now a weapon sharpened by fire, ready for the next stage of the conflict, where its true legacy would be forged. By the spring of 1943, the airspace over the Kuban bridgehead had become one of the most fiercely contested regions in the entire Eastern Front. Here, above fields already scarred by months of retreat and counterattack, the Soviet Air Force and the German Luftwaffe met in a sustained struggle that would define the future of both. The Kuban did more than host battles. It became a laboratory, a proving ground where new tactics were tested under fire and where the strengths and weaknesses of every aircraft were revealed with unsparing clarity. In this crucible, the P-39 Airacobra found the moment that would transform its identity forever. Soviet squadrons, trained under the principles introduced by Alexander Pokrishkin, executed moves with a precision unseen earlier in the war. Each sortie began with the careful construction of the Kuban ladder, a tiered formation rising invisibly above the contested zone. One rung carried the role of bait, another of interception, another of decisive attack. Every shift in altitude or bearing was relayed through the clear American radios fitted in the Airacobra's cockpit. What looked to German observers like spontaneous Soviet coordination was in fact the deliberate unfolding of a system that fused doctrine, discipline, and machine into a single, responsive structure. The Germans soon coined a name for the aircraft that harassed them from below: Die grüne Schlange, the green snake. The Airacobra often appeared without warning, rising from the shadows of hills, riverbeds, or low cloud layers in sudden violent bursts. Many pilots claimed they first noticed the P-39 only when cannon rounds struck their aircraft. These attacks, often launched from beneath a bomber's blind spot, exploited the very limitation that had doomed the fighter in American service: its lack of high-altitude performance. At the Kuban, altitude was not dominance. Timing was. In this environment, the Airacobra dominated a niche that few other fighters could fill. The German Me-109 excelled at altitude. The FW-190 thrived in medium-height slashing attacks. But below the cloud base, in the dense, shifting air where reflexes mattered more than raw power, the P-39 became something close to an ideal weapon. Its mid-engine balance delivered stability through rough maneuvers. Its strong acceleration at low altitude allowed it to strike and vanish. Its heavy armament finished the engagements with finality. The aircraft was excelling in the one domain it had never been designed for, but where it now fit with uncanny precision. As Soviet pilots adapted to the new tactics, their kill rates began to rise sharply. Some squadrons reported weeks in which their pilots averaged multiple victories each, a scale of success rarely seen in the West. The Arakobra's 37mm cannon proved brutally effective against the He-111s and Ju-88s, attempting to supply German units in the region. Where Western air forces often required long engagements to bring down a bomber, Soviet pilots described moments where a single burst broke an aircraft apart. On certain days of heavy fighting, bombers fell in such numbers that Soviet ground troops claimed the sky resembled a burning arch above the front. Luftwaffe reports from the Kuban grew increasingly bleak. Fighter groups, once confident in their numerical and qualitative edge, recorded catastrophic attrition as the combined effect of Soviet tactics and P-39 firepower took its toll. German commanders noted that their formations could no longer descend into low-altitude escape dives without risking interception by Airacobras rising from the ground like a coordinated trap. In a theater where every supply flight mattered, the loss of bomber crews and aircraft began to tilt the balance. What the Soviets lacked in altitude superiority, they made up for with a control of the low air war that the Germans could neither predict nor counter. These successes reshaped the Arakobra's reputation. The aircraft that had once arrived in crates, dismissed as a flawed American experiment, now carried the weight of Soviet resurgence. Pilots decorated their P-39s with personal insignia, ground crews worked with pride, and commanders issued requests for more of the fighter that had proven itself in the most unforgiving skies of the war. The machine had crossed a threshold, from an unwanted import to a symbol of adaptation and resilience. And, as the summer of 1943 approached, the battles of Kuban were only a prelude. Ahead lay an even larger confrontation, one that would test not only the aircraft but the doctrine, discipline, and belief that had grown around it. By the summer of 1943, as the thunder of Kursk rolled across the steppe, the P-39 Airacobra no longer fought for its reputation. It fought for momentum, part of a vast Soviet machine pressing westward with new confidence. The receding German line left behind a landscape of wrecked armor, scorched fields, and improvised defenses. Above this shifting front, Airacobra squadrons carved narrow aerial corridors through which entire armies advanced. Their missions were not dramatic in altitude or spectacle. They were precise strokes delivered close to the ground, the kind of attacks that loosened the bolts of an already strained enemy front. These strikes carried an unmistakable purpose. German logistics, stretched thin after months of attrition, relied on columns of trucks, railcars, and river ferries to stabilize each new defensive line. Airacobra pilots learned to dismantle these efforts with ruthless efficiency. Flying just above the treetops, they swept along the roads at speeds that blurred the landscape into streaks of color. Each attack delayed reinforcements, choked supply routes, and left frontline units exposed. German attempts to reconstitute shattered sectors often collapsed before they could begin, undone by the low-altitude hunters that appeared without warning and vanished just as quickly. Timing became the essential language of the air. Soviet commanders coordinated P-39 attacks with armored breakthroughs, ensuring that when tank armies surged forward, the sky above them remained hostile to any German response. Pilots studied the rhythm of ground operations, how infantry advanced, how artillery shifted positions, how gaps widened, until their interventions felt woven into the larger choreography of the offensive. The Arakobra's speed near the ground made it an ideal sentinel. Arriving at the precise moment a German column attempted to regroup or counterattack. These moments were brief, measured in minutes, but they shaped the course of days. A new partnership emerged during these operations: the escort of Il-2 Sturmovix. The slow, armored ground attack aircraft had always been vulnerable to interception, especially during the opening passes of a strike. Yet with Airacobras guarding their flanks and clearing the air ahead, the Il-2s found room to operate. The P-39s used their heavy armament to break up enemy formations and their disciplined formations to shield the Sturmovix during the most dangerous portions of a run. The pairing was not glamorous. It was careful, efficient, and deadly. Together, they formed an assault combination the Germans learned to recognize with dread. The Airacobra proved its resilience in these missions. Low-level operations exposed fighters to constant ground fire, machine guns, flak bursts, and the unpredictable hazards of flying through a battlefield's debris-filled air. Lighter aircraft often returned damaged or didn't return at all. But the P-39, with its sturdy frame and armored cockpit, absorbed punishment with a stubbornness that surprised even its most seasoned pilots. Many limped back on one magneto, cylinders blown, oil streaked across the canopy. Mechanics learned to gauge a pilot's survival by the dents in the fuselage and the holes in the tailplane, markers of a machine built to endure more than its appearance suggested. With each month of advance, the regiment's flying Airacobras deepened their familiarity with the aircraft. Pilots learned the subtle cues of the Allison engine, the exact throttle settings that allowed for tight turns without bleeding too much speed, the small trim adjustments that held the aircraft steady during cannon fire. Quirks that had once been complaints became intimate knowledge, part of the craft passed from veteran to recruit. The P-39 gained not only acceptance but loyalty, a rare bond between pilot and machine forged across thousands of sorties. By late 1943, German pilots began referring to certain low-altitude sectors as Cobraland, Cobra Country. They knew that venturing too low over Soviet positions risked an encounter with a fighter that had mastered the ground-hugging war the Eastern Front increasingly demanded. Reports described sudden attacks rising out of the horizon line, the brief flare of cannon fire, and the abrupt disappearance of the Soviet fighter back into the undergrowth of smoke and terrain. The long push west would continue, carrying Airacobra regiments through Ukraine and toward the borders of Eastern Europe. But as powerful as these advances were, the greatest test of their discipline and doctrine still lay ahead, waiting in the storm of 1944, where the limits of the machine and the men who flew it would be challenged once more. By 1944, as the Red Air Force surged westward and the Luftwaffe fought with dwindling reserves of aircraft, fuel, and trained pilots, a quiet reckoning took place within Soviet headquarters. The reports arriving from frontline regiments, once scattered and anecdotal, now painted a consistent picture. The P-39 Airacobra, dismissed in American service, doubted by its own designers, and nearly abandoned by the Army Air Forces, had become one of the highest-scoring fighters in the entire Soviet arsenal. The numbers were too persistent, too uniform across too many sectors, to be dismissed as enthusiasm. They revealed a truth that neither Washington nor Buffalo had ever anticipated. The scale of Soviet Airacobra activity was staggering. While Western pilots often rotated out of combat after a defined tour, Soviet aviators flew until wounded, reassigned, or killed. As a result, Airacobra pilots routinely accumulated more than 400 sorties, some even approaching 500. In winter, they flew over frozen rivers, in spring, through clouds of thawing mud, in summer across the glare of the steppe. The aircraft's reliability, once questioned after early American experience, became evident in this relentless tempo. The Allison engine, maintained by crews who had mastered its temperament, ran cleanly through long campaigns. Airframes that had already survived Stalingrad and Kuban continued into Belarus and Poland, bearing the scars of dozens of engagements. A machine that was supposed to be delicate had proven remarkably durable. No pilot embodied this reversal more visibly than Alexander Pukrishkin. By the end of 1944, his official tally surpassed 40 confirmed aerial victories in the P-39 alone. His actual count may have been higher, limited as it was by Soviet confirmation procedures. Yet the number mattered less than the consistency of his performance. Pukrishkin had used the Airacobra not merely as a fighter but as a platform for innovation, refining energy maneuverability thinking, shaping regimental discipline, and orchestrating engagements with a precision that gave the Soviets a rare advantage in the air. Each of his victories was a data point in a broader transformation. The success of a doctrine joined to a machine once thought unsuitable for serious war. His achievements, however, were mirrored by dozens of others. Grigory Rechkalov, Nikolai Gulayev, Anatoly Golubov, and scores of lesser-known pilots added their names to a growing list of Airacobra aces. Their diaries record the same themes: confidence in the aircraft's stability, trust in its firepower, and an understanding that the P-39 rewarded discipline more than daring. For every pilot whose name became legend, hundreds contributed to the cumulative weight of the aircraft's performance. When the Soviet High Command reviewed the operational summaries of 1943 to 44, one figure stood out above all others. Airacobra-equipped units had claimed more than 2,400 confirmed victories, a tally that surpassed all expectations and challenged the assumptions of every Western analyst. The reaction in the United States was one of quiet astonishment. American officers had long regarded the P-39 as marginal, adequate only for training or emergency use. They assumed it would be replaced quickly in theater and remembered its shortcomings more readily than its strengths. Yet the reports arriving from the Eastern Front told a different story. The worst American fighter, burdened by an operational ceiling that made it uncompetitive in the Pacific or Europe, had become a legend in a theater defined by low-altitude ferocity. The difference lay not in the aircraft but in the context, and in the pilots who discovered that its weaknesses were irrelevant in a war fought just above the Earth. Historians later confirmed what the wartime numbers implied. No American-built fighter achieved more Soviet aerial victories than the P-39 Airacobra. Not the P-40, which served widely. Not the P-47, admired for its toughness. Not even the P-51, celebrated for its high-altitude excellence. In the vast expanse of the Eastern Front, with its treetop duels, armored breakthroughs, and ceaseless low-level engagements, the Airacobra had found the environment for which it was never intentionally designed. Its mid-engine balance, its concentrated firepower, and its rugged frame aligned with a battlefield that devoured fragile aircraft and rewarded those that could both strike and survive. The aircraft's redemption was not carried by mythology or selective memory. It was measured in sorties flown, missions completed, units supported, and enemies shot down. It was written in the cold arithmetic of combat performance, line after line of logbook entries, each recording altitude, ammunition, and conformation. Beneath the numbers lay a deeper irony. The aircraft's transformation had not come from redesign or radical modification, but from recognition. The Soviets had asked a question no one else had bothered to ask. What is this machine good at? The answers they found reshaped not only the aircraft's story, but the course of the air war along the Eastern Front. And as 1944 gave way to the final year of the conflict, the P-39 carried its pilots closer to the borders of a collapsing Reich, a role unimagined when the first prototype rolled out of its hangar in Buffalo. Beyond those borders lay the final proving grounds, where the Airacobra's reputation would be sealed one last time. When the war finally ended and the noise of engines faded into the cautious quiet of 1945, the P-39 Airacobra carried with it a legacy that few had predicted. In the first months of peace, delegations of Soviet pilots, some already legends, others simply survivors of hundreds of sorties, made their way to the United States. Their visits were not political displays or ceremonial gestures. They came with a simple intention: to thank the engineers and workers at Bell Aircraft who had built the machine that had carried them through the hardest years of the Eastern Front. For many of the men in Buffalo, it was the first time they understood what their aircraft had truly accomplished. At Bell's factory floors, now quieter than the frantic wartime ramp-up years, American workers listened with a mixture of surprise and disbelief. They had heard only fragments of the Airacobra's story once it left their production lines. In U.S. service, it had been overshadowed, criticized for its ceiling, and replaced wherever possible. Many assumed it had failed abroad as completely as it had at home. Yet here stood pilots who credited the P-39 with their survival. Pilots who spoke not of shortcomings, but of victories, endurance, and an aircraft that never abandoned them even in the lowest, most dangerous skies of the war. As the Airacobra regiments demobilized, the Soviet Union continued to operate the aircraft long after 1945. 4 years, it served in border patrols, training units, and regional defense roles, outlasting more celebrated fighters whose reputations had dimmed with the arrival of jet aircraft. The Airacobra proved easier to maintain in peacetime and remained familiar to generations of pilots who trusted its temperament. Its long post-war service spoke quietly of a truth that had gone unrecognized during its early American years. It had never been fragile. It had simply been asked to fight in the wrong sky. Only after the war did comprehensive evaluations begin, conducted without the urgency or doctrinal assumptions that had shaped its reputation. Engineers studied its structural integrity, its airflow characteristics, its rolling behavior, and the performance of the mid-engine layout. Test pilots flew it again, this time measuring not how it compared to the dreams of 1937, but how it matched the realities reported from the Eastern Front. The findings were striking. The Airacobra's performance envelope was wide, stable, and robust when used at low altitude. The very trait that had doomed it in American doctrine had made it invaluable in Soviet service. Gradually, a clearer picture formed. The aircraft had not been a flawed design. It had been the victim of a mismatch between doctrine and capability. The United States sought fighters that could climb above 25,000 feet, exploit turbo supercharging, and hunt bombers across vast distances. The P-39, robbed of its turbocharger during early production, could not meet that expectation. But the Soviets did not fight that war. Their battlefield existed below the clouds, among artillery smoke, river valleys, and treetops. In that world, the Airacobra was not merely adequate, it was exceptional. This understanding reshaped the conversation around the aircraft. Historians, engineers, and former pilots began referring to its story not as a failure, but as a case study in how strategy can condemn or redeem a machine. Tools are judged by the tasks they are given, and the P-39 had been asked to perform a mission it was never built to fulfill. Once placed in the environment where its strengths mattered, it became something else entirely, a weapon of precision, stability, and reliability. By the late 20th century, the Airacobra's legacy had begun its slow correction. What had once been dismissed as an American misstep was reinterpreted as an innovation misunderstood in its time, an aircraft ahead of its doctrine, punished by altitude, but perfected at the ground level where the Eastern Front decided its fate. And as historians traced the arc of its journey from rejection to redemption, they found a story not of engineering failure, but of the overlooked power of context. Ahead lay the final act of that story, the moment when myth, memory, and data would merge to reveal what the Airacobra truly was. In the quiet years that followed the Second World War, historians, engineers, and former pilots began to look back at the P-39 Airacobra with a distance that wartime urgency had never allowed. What emerged from their evaluations was not simply the story of a fighter aircraft, but a broader caution: the danger of judging any machine outside the context for which it was unwittingly shaped. The trajectory of the Airacobra, its rejection in the West, its success in the East, became a lesson in how quickly assumptions can harden into reputation, and how easily reputation can obscure reality. Nowhere was this clearer than in the pilots who flew it across the Eastern Front. They had taken the aircraft's supposed weaknesses, its low ceiling, its unconventional balance, its heavy cannon, and turned them into sources of unexpected strength. They did not ask the P-39 to be an interceptor above 25,000 feet. They asked it to be a hunter in the smoke-filled air just above the ground. Through discipline, tactical clarity, and a ruthless willingness to tailor doctrine to conditions, Soviet aviators transformed the aircraft into something far more dangerous than its designers had predicted. In their hands, flaws became tools, and limitations became the outlines of new methods. This transformation reflected a truth that the war had made painfully clear: adaptability mattered more than ideal specifications printed on blueprints. The Eastern Front rewarded machines that could thrive under strain, endure rough handling, and deliver decisive strikes in cramped, chaotic airspace. The P-39, dismissed elsewhere for failing to meet high-altitude expectations, fit these demands with a kind of accidental perfection. Its stability at low level, once considered a compromise, became a foundation. Its concentrated firepower, criticized as excessive, became a tactical cornerstone. Its simplicity and maintenance, ignored in its evaluations abroad, became invaluable to frontline mechanics. As post-war aviation advanced, designers revisited the mid-engine concept that had once made the Airacobra seem eccentric. They recognized that Bell Aircraft's decision, radical in the 1930s, anticipated ideas that would dominate jet-era thinking: optimal center of gravity, cleaner aerodynamics, and unobstructed space for heavy armament. What seemed odd in the age of piston engines became intuitive in the age of turbine power. The Airacobra, once mocked for its layout, had quietly stood decades ahead of its time. Historians found in its journey a second lesson: that wartime reputation is rarely aligned with operational reality. Reports shaped by doctrine, shaped by expectation, shaped by the needs of one theater often obscure truths discovered in another. The Airacobra's Western reputation as a failure persisted for years, long after data from the Eastern Front had proven otherwise. It took the sober weight of operational records, sortie numbers, loss rates, confirmed victories, to recalibrate the narrative. The aircraft had not changed. Only the lens through which it was seen had. With time, the Airacobra became more than a military artifact. It became a metaphor for overlooked potential. Its story reminded engineers that innovation often arrives in imperfect forms. It reminded tacticians that doctrine must bend before the realities of battle. And it reminded historians that the meaning of a machine is rarely fixed. It is shaped by the environment, the people who use it, and the demands of the moment. What once seemed an engineering misstep now appears as unconventional brilliance, an aircraft whose true capabilities emerged only when placed in the one theater harsh enough and flexible enough to reveal them. And as the final reckoning of its wartime performance settled into history, it became clear that the Airacobra's legacy was not one of failure, but of rediscovered purpose, waiting for the moment and the pilots who could see it. In the decades after the war, when memories had softened but not yet dimmed, veterans of the Eastern Front were often asked which aircraft had given them the most confidence in moments when chaos pressed against the canopy. Their answers were quiet, consistent, and surprisingly uniform. Many spoke of the P-39 Airacobra, not as a miracle, not as a perfect fighter, but as a machine that gave them control when little else in the sky could be controlled. In a war defined by sudden shifts of fortune, that sense of command mattered more than speed charts or design philosophy. Pilots who had flown hundreds of sorties described the Airacobra with a kind of unadorned affection. They said it fit the Eastern Front like a glove, a phrase that recurred so often across interviews and regimental memoirs that it began to feel almost scripted. Yet each man meant it literally. The aircraft responded cleanly, rolled predictably, and delivered firepower with a finality that made even brief windows of opportunity count. In the low, smoke-thick battles over rivers, forests, and shattered cities, the P-39 offered them something rare: a fighter that behaved exactly as expected, even when the world around it did not. As researchers and historians pieced together the operational record, this impression gained weight. After combing through mission logs, confirmation reports, and unit diaries, they compiled a final tally: more than 2,400 confirmed aerial victories scored by Soviet Airacobra regiments. It was a number that no amount of interpretation could soften or exaggerate. It stood as one of the clearest statistical accomplishments of any Lend-Lease aircraft, and one of the most definitive reversals of reputation in aviation history. What had once been considered unsuitable for frontline service had become, by sheer performance, a cornerstone of Soviet air power. In Buffalo, where the old Bell factories had long since gone quiet, retired engineers looked back on the Airacobra with a mixture of pride and humility. Many noted that the aircraft succeeded only when flown in the environment they had once imagined for it: an arena of low-altitude combat where fast roll rates, mid-engine balance, and concentrated firepower outweighed the absence of a turbo supercharger. It was as if the aircraft had carried, within its original concept, the seeds of a future no one in the United States had ever fully explored. The Soviets had simply read the design differently, with a clarity sharpened by necessity. This divergence of memory deepened over time. In the United States, the P-39 remained a curiosity. an interesting but flawed fighter overshadowed by the more glamorous aircraft that followed. Museums displayed it with modest placards, acknowledging its unusual design and limited American service. In the Soviet Union, however, the Airacobra occupied a different corner of history. It became a symbol of endurance, of tactical innovation, of the strange compatibility between a foreign machine and a domestic battlefield. For the pilots who survived the hardest years of the war, it was not a footnote, but a companion. And so the story of the Airacobra settled into one of the war's greatest ironies. The fighter mocked in American hangars became a cornerstone of victory thousands of miles away. The aircraft judged a failure by paper specifications proved itself through the relentless arithmetic of combat. And the machine assumed to be an engineering misstep revealed itself, only after years of reflection, as something closer to unconventional brilliance. In the end, the judgment so casually offered in 1942 had to be rewritten. They called it America's worst fighter, until Soviet pilots, flying low over a battlefield that matched its strengths perfectly, scored 2,400 kills with it.